My name is Lexi Bowler. I'm a community worker in Sheffield and I'm a member of the Socialist Workers' Party. This meeting is a book launch, and it's a book launch of Alex Callinicos' book. Now, Alex is the editor of the International Socialist Journal. He's a professor at London King's College, and he's wrote a number of books. For example, The Revolutionary Ideas of Karl Marx, which is a fantastic book, and he's going to be speaking for about 30 to 35 minutes on his latest book, which is Bonfire of Illusions, the twin crisis of the liberal world. There will be a speaker slip system operated in this meeting. I think there will be people walking around with slips, so if you can fill one in and pass them over. Right, we'll start without any further ado.
Thanks very much. I have to say that what I'm going to be talking about is mainly the contemporary global economic crisis, and it makes me talking about this subject and this Marxism makes me acutely aware of the absence of Chris Harman, because Chris, more than anyone else, developed our understanding both of the dynamics of capitalist crisis and of the particular nature of the present crisis. So I do feel the kind of burden of his absence particularly strongly here today. Chris, of course, would be very impatient with that kind of stuff and just say, get on with it. So I will get on with it. I want to start the substance of what I say by quoting, I quoted him yesterday, but it's still an important statement, quoting the American Keynesian economist, a leading figure on the left wing of the, centre of the Democratic Party in the United States, Paul Krugman, who wrote in the New York Times about a week ago that he thought we were in the early stages of what he called the third depression. And in other words, what he was doing was comparing the present economic crisis to two earlier, very severe crises in the history of capitalism. What he calls the long depression, the long period of economic stagnation and slow growth that capitalism experienced between roughly the middle of the 1870s and the middle of the 1890s, and then, of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the worst economic crisis in the history of capitalism. And I think that the placing the present economic crisis in that way historically is very useful, because what it helps us to understand is that the crisis that broke out, that became visible when the international banking system froze in the summer of 2007, that's to say nearly 3 years ago, wasn't just a concentrated catastrophic event, a huge, as mainstream economists like to call it, shock to the capitalist economic system. You know, a shock is something, I think, necessarily that's quite brief, and then the system can shake off and carry on with in its normal way. What we're in is a protracted economic crisis. We have to see this crisis not just in a historical context, but as itself a historical phenomenon. In other words, something that has a relatively protracted duration in time, and that goes through a number of different stages. What my book Bonfire Illusions is really about is trying to situate this crisis historically, and I try to do that. Maybe it's a bit fanciful, but I try to do that with reference to two events that took place in the late summer and early autumn of 2008. First of all, the war between Russia and Georgia in August 2008, and secondly, the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one of the biggest investment banks in the United States. One of the moment at which the economic crisis morphed into a global economic catastrophe which took place on the 15th of September 2008. Why did I talk about those two events? Lehman Brothers in a way has kind of passed into almost the folklore of the crisis as a decisive event. I talked also about the war between Russia and Georgia, because what I argue in the book is that we have to see the late summer and autumn of 2008 as the historical moment when the post-Cold War era comes to an end. The post-Cold War era, starting at the end of the 1980s, which sees the global triumph of liberal capitalism against its rival, the state capitalist, Stalinist countries, above all, the Soviet Union. And that involves, economically, neoliberalism, a set of hard free market policies becoming the orthodoxy that was institutionalized and enforced on a global scale, but that the entrenchment of neoliberalism as a set of economic policies, or as I like to call it, an economic policy regime, something that is institutionalized and shapes the adoption of policies, is accompanied by the US emerging as the unchallenged dominant global power. And if we want to understand the geopolitics, in other words, the politics of rivalries between different states of the subsequent 2 decades, it's really about the United States successive administrations using a number of different methods in order to entrench and perpetuate that global domination. Policies like the expansion of the European Union and of NATO into Eastern and Central Europe are part of that process of attempted entrenchment. So, of course, is the war in Iraq, the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And what I argue is that the late summer and the early autumn of 2008 is the moment at which it becomes clear that that period is over. Economic neoliberalism as an ideology is trashed by the financial crash and what that leads to, which is the global economic slump, the worst since the Second World War. But also it becomes very clear that the attempt to entrench and perpetuate US hegemony has also failed. It failed fundamentally because of the failure of the invasion of Iraq to lead to both the underpinning of US domination of the Middle East, but also to the spread of pro-Western, at least superficially liberal democratic regimes in the Middle East. But that's underlined and reinforced when the Russians essentially wage a war on Georgia. There's argument about who started it, but that's really a secondary thing. They wage war on Georgia essentially as a way of saying, we're going to smash militarily one of the most pro-Western regimes on our borders in order to demonstrate that the expansion of NATO has to stop. We are not going to allow NATO to encircle us to our very, very borders. And the Russians are completely successful in this. The issue of Georgia and Ukraine becoming members of NATO has just gone off the geopolitical agenda. Ukraine now has a president who is pro-Russian and who signed a deal that allows the Russian Baltic Fleet, sorry, not Baltic, wrong sea altogether, the Russian Black Sea Fleet to continue to be based in the Crimea, which is part of the Ukraine. So that war rendered visible if you like, the containment of US hegemony, and underlined that the attempt to entrench US hegemony had failed, and that the US was having to confront the decline in its relative power compared to other leading capitalist states. And of course the economic crisis itself further underlines that, because it was a crisis that started in the United States itself, that is widely held to be a consequence of the kind of deregulated free market capitalism that prevails in the United States, and so on. But it's also talking about the Georgian war was a way of underlining that the crisis isn't simply an economic event, it's also a political event with all sorts of implications for the relations between states and also all sorts of ideological implications. When the title of my book talks about Bonfire of Illusions, the main illusions that I'm talking about are represented by the neoliberal ideology itself, thrown into question massively by the crisis. What I want to do now, however, is to focus on the economic dimension of the crisis, because this, as I said, this is a historically evolving phenomenon, and it's very important to understand that. Of course, it was a crisis that started in the financial system, or more precisely, it started in the American housing finance system, the famous subprime mortgages that were sold on an industrial scale to people who were too poor to actually sustain and repay or even keep up the interest repayments on the loans that were being made to them. And when it became clearer that larger and larger numbers of people who received these subprime mortgages weren't able to repay the loans, that was the moment at which the whole American and European financial system started to unravel. But the financial crisis has much deeper roots, and I want to talk first of all about the background in the financial system to that unravelling, and then to talk about even deeper roots. There's a lot of talk about financial imbalances. There's a lot of talk about how the global economy suffers from the fact that in certain ways the financial system is deeply unbalanced. And that's right, although it doesn't get to the core of the problem. But let me mention two imbalances in particular. First of all, and this is something that's become even more visible as a result of the economic crisis, there's a division between creditor and debtor states. In other words, there's a division between states that are very successful at exporting, that run big surpluses on their balance of payments, and that use those surpluses to lend money to other states. And the most important creditor states in the world, although there are a number of others, are China and Germany. These are both incredibly successful exporting economies, the two biggest exporting economies in the world, great hubs of manufacturing production. As a result, they run big balance of payment surpluses, and they use those surpluses to lend money to, guess who? The debtor states. That's the other side of the division. Who are the debtor states? Well, interestingly enough, the most, and famously now, the biggest debtor state in the world is the United States. And the United States secures massive financial inflows, not just from China and the rest of East Asia, but actually also from Germany, from Japan, from the oil exporting states in the world as well, that have allowed the US to cover its massive balance of payments deficit. In other balance of payments deficit means that the US imports far more than it exports. How does it pay for the imports that it doesn't cover through exporting? Essentially through borrowing money from the rest of the world. And there's a very interesting study by an American political economist called Herman Schwartz, who shows that because the US is the centre of the global financial system, and in particular issues the world's main reserve currency, it's able to organise those financial flows in such a way that the countries that lend money to the United States get a much lower return on the loans they make to the United States than American companies do when they invest in different parts of the world. So it's an incredibly favourable set of arrangements for the United States. Also, if we look within the European Union, or more specifically within the Eurozones, there's the same division between creditor and debtor states. Germany is the great creditor state of the European Union, this great exporter of goods, but also of capital. Where does and capital go to? Crucially, they go to the weaker and smaller economies of the Eurozone, the ones that are in the news at the minute because of their inability to repay their debts, like Greece, like Portugal, like Spain, like Ireland, and so on. They are the debtor states of the European Union. But when you look at it in those sorts of terms, you see that there's a relation of interdependence. Although the German political elite goes on about how, greedy and lazy Greeks are, and so on and so forth, in fact, German capitalism is dependent upon those other economies to which they lend money in order to provide markets for their goods. And this is a critical contradiction that I want to return to. The second form of imbalance in the financial system is what developed particularly from the early to mid-1990s onwards, which is an enormous proliferation of financial speculation, particularly centred on Wall Street in the United States and on the city of London. These two great financial centres became massive centres for financial speculation, and in particular in the past decade, in the decade of the 2000s, they became mass producers of different kinds of credit derivatives that formed particularly effective ways of not just of speculating, but of passing on debt from one lender to another, so that the whole system of subprime mortgages and so on involved. Subprime mortgages were attractive to the banks because the worse a bet you are, the less good a risk you are, the higher the interest you have to pay. So if you had a subprime mortgage, you had to pay particularly high interest. But because of the risk involved in these subprime mortgages, the banks didn't want to hold on to them. So they would package them up into different forms of credit derivative, like the collateralized debt obligations that became particularly notorious. They would package them into derivatives that they would then sell on to other investors who would then take the risk rather than the originating banks themselves. And it's emerged that the American banks were extremely effective at selling the riskiest mortgages on, particularly to European and especially German banks. And this helps to explain why a crisis in the American housing market that develops as subprime borrowers default on their mortgages spreads rapidly to affect the European banking system as well. Now, this whole business of lending on a massive scale and then repackaging the debt in derivatives and passing them on from one bank or quasi-bank to another presupposed the availability of cheap credit. It presupposed borrowing being on a large scale very cheap. This was partly enabled by the very low interest rates that particularly the American Central Bank, the Federal Reserve, ran in the middle part of the last decade, but it also was made possible by the fact that there was this great flow of money from countries like China pouring into the United States and then effectively seized on by the American banks and used to fund the speculative activities that they were engaged in. So the imbalances were connected. Now, this then leads to the next point, which is most of the analyses of the crisis go on about this kind of stuff. The global financial imbalances, speculation, low interest rates, the deregulation of the financial system that took place from the 1970s and 1980s onwards. They go on about all that, and that's where they stop in an explanation of the crisis. We don't, because the crisis has to be seen against the background of a much longer term crisis of over-accumulation and profitability that develops in global capitalism in the course of the 1960s and which precipitates the global economy into a protracted period of crises, of which this is simply the latest one. the crisis of profitability has been very well analysed by a number of Marxist economists in our own tradition, Chris Harman and more recently Joseph Chunara, but a number of other Marxist economists, Bob Brenner and Andrew Kleeman in the United States, have demonstrated the scale of the crisis of profitability that developed. Now, what neoliberalism was really about was a concerted effort to overcome the crisis of profitability by forcing up the rate of unemployment, by weakening workers' organisation, by deregulating labour markets and so on and so forth, forcing through a whole series of changes which would have the effect of increasing the rate of exploitation. In other words, increasing the level at which workers were exploited and thereby forcing up the rate of profit. And it was successful to the extent that the rate of exploitation did increase. If you look, for example, at the United States, real wages have either stagnated or shrunk since the late 1970s, which is an incredible fact. The biggest and richest capitalist country in the world has operated on the basis of what's called wage repression for more than 30 years now. And what we've seen in recent years is wage repression spreading, so that in Germany, since the beginning of the millennium, we've seen labour costs held steady, sharp pressure on working class living standards, which is a very striking development, given that Germany is a society that's since the Second World War been seen as a high-wage economy with strong trade unions and so on. So they do increase the exploitation of workers. However, the rate of profit, if you're going to be technical about it, is the relationship between the mass of profits that are extracted from workers and the mass of capital that's invested. And the mass of capital doesn't just include wages, it includes all the other things that bosses invest in, machinery, buildings, etc., etc., etc. And what you see is that even though there's a partial recovery in profitability, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s, the period of neoliberal triumph, it doesn't restore the rate of profit to the levels of the post-World War boom of the 1950s and 1960s. Now, why do I go into all this? I go into all this because I think we have to see the whole set of financial imbalances, and in particular the explosion of financial speculation that develops especially, although not exclusively, in the United States in the 1990s and in the 2000s as essentially having, this wasn't the plan, but this is how things worked out, as essentially providing an alternative way of driving economic growth in the absence of the rate of profit being restored to healthy levels. So if we look at the period before the present economic crisis, you have the speculative boom, which is characterised in particular by big increases in housing prices. Now, if you take out a mortgage to buy a house and its price rises, psychologically you probably feel richer because the value of your house has risen. More important, economically, you could borrow more on the basis that the price of your house has risen. And through borrowing, well, if you borrow more, you could spend more. And this happened on a very large scale in the United States, and also happened here during the speculative boom that preceded the present crisis. This was a way of providing the effective demand, the demand for goods and services that was necessary to sustain economic growth. One Italian Marxist economist calls this, going much too slowly, calls this privatised Keynesianism. Maynard Keynes in the 1930s argued that the state had to step in and through its spending provide the effective demand that was necessary to sustain full employment when the private sector was too weak to do so. And what essentially we see is the financial system offering, in its own bizarre way, an alternative way of sustaining effective demand. So that's well and good, so long as the speculative boom is continuing. But speculative in 2007 and 2008. We have that wave of speculation ending in the worst financial crash since 1929. But because of the role that financial speculation had been playing in the previous decades, the financial crash, in cracking up the financial system and stopping banks, for example, relying on credit derivatives in the way in which they had, the value of collateralized debt obligations, for example, has absolutely collapsed since 2007-2008. The collapse of the financial system destroys what had been the motor of the world economy. And that's why we find ourselves in such a serious economic slump. Now, that then leaves the world's ruling classes facing a very serious dilemma. Because on the one hand, the latest stage of the crisis is what they call the sovereign debt crisis. What do they mean by that? What do they mean by that? What the sovereign debt crisis is essentially the following. You have the outbreak of the crisis, you have the financial crash in autumn 2008, followed by a global economic slump. In order to rescue the financial system, and in response to the economic crisis, governments increase spending on a very large scale. How do they find the money to increase spending? They find it by borrowing. The result is government debt increases massively. That then, what you then have is as a result of the rescues that take place, the bailouts, which are on a titanic scale, according to the Bank of England, between them, the US, Britain and the Eurozone spend $14 trillion on bailing out the financial system. So, slightly over a year ago, thanks to these huge infusions of money, the financial markets revived. And the banks and quasi-banks and so on that operate in the financial markets are interested in making profits. They look around for a way of making profits. And they look at the huge increase in government debt and they say, hey, some states aren't going to be able to cope with this amount of debt. They're going to be forced into bankruptcy. So what we need to do is start speculating against those governments, selling their currency, selling the government bonds that these states issue as a way of borrowing money. And of course it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. This is what happened to Greece in the early part of this year. In the early part of this year, the Greek government finds the price of its bonds falling massively on financial markets because of this kind of speculation, and when the prices fall, that means that the interest that they have to pay on their loans rises. They can't afford to make the interest repayments. They struggle to find people to buy the bonds when they have to sell them to them, and so on. So a very serious financial. So we have the crisis of sovereign debt. But this is a more superficial expression of something deeper. The deeper thing that it expresses is the following. I said that the underlying crisis is a crisis of over-accumulation and profitability. Putting it crudely, what that means is there's too much capital relative to the massive profits that capital is seeking to get hold of. Now, they tried to restore profitability by squeezing workers and that way increasing the massive profits, but it hasn't worked out too well. The other way of restoring profitability is to reduce the amount of capital, to destroy capital, what Marx calls the devaluation of capital, which is something that happens in economic crisis. Firms go bust, their stuff is sold off cheap or simply scrapped, so a big chunk of the capital in the system can be destroyed in economic crises. But the effect of the bailouts is to ensure that much less capital is destroyed than otherwise would have been the case. And this isn't just true of the banks. The world's car industry suffers from massive overcapacity. Last year, the major car firms had the ability to produce something like 30 million more units, more cars and vans and so on, than they could actually sell. But no major car firm has gone bust as a result of the crisis. I mean, it's true that Chrysler and General Motors went formally into bankruptcy, but that was a form of state-organised rescue and restructuring of those firms, not their disappearance. So the problem of the over-accumulation of capital hasn't gone away as a result of the crisis. But then that then leads to the other horn of their dilemma, which is that confronted with this situation of higher government indebtedness and continuing over-accumulation, you have the revival of the hard right, articulated, unfortunately, especially by our own delightful liberal conservative coalition. And this was the policy adopted at by the G20 in their summit a couple of weeks ago in Toronto, which is to say, we can't afford this level of public debt, therefore we have savagely to cut public spending, we have to push through austerity policies. The effect of this will be to liberate the private sector, which is labouring under the heavy burden of a bloated public sector, and once the private sector is liberated, then economies can revive through exporting, and there all sorts of nonsensical historical parallels are used. I mean, for a while the Liberals and Conservatives talked about the example offered by Canada in the 1990s when the Canadian government slashed spending massively to reduce its deficit, and that didn't lead to the end of the world economically. What they don't notice when they use this example was that this happened at a time when the American economy, Canada's huge neighbour in other words, was expanding considerably as a result of the first of the speculative booms that the United States experienced during that period. But now we're in a situation where, with at present the exception of the United States, all the major economies, and a lot of the little ones, are saying that they're going to pursue austerity policies. They're going to cut public spending and they're going to increase exports. Question, where are the markets going to come for these exports? And when you ask this question, there is no answer. And this is precisely what happened during the Great Depression of the 1930s. That governments adopted policies that squeezed their own markets in the hope that their neighbours wouldn't squeeze their markets and they'd be able to export their neighbours. But if everyone squeezes their markets, no one has a market to export to. So there's a real danger that the austerity policies will drive the world economy into a cycle of decline. The US is resisting these policies, but also Obama has been partially critical of the shift to austerity. But if you listen to what he's saying, he's also saying that the US can no longer be the consumer of last resort for the world economy. He said countries can't expect to solve their problems by exporting to the United States. He's playing fairly hardball with China, which is enormously successful at exporting to the United States, and so on and so forth. I'm going to shut up in a minute, Maxine, don't worry. What this means is that the ruling classes globally are caught in the horns of a dilemma for which they have no solution. They have a hunch that the way out has to involve squeezing and battering their own working classes, but that's more matter of instinct than any kind of coherent policy and strategy. If you like, it's the default position. We're in trouble, so we'll hit our workers as hard as possible. And what this then, of course, does is to put the politics of resisting austerity as central to the agenda of the radical and the revolutionary left, not just in this country, but I think globally. We can see this very clearly if we look at what's happening in other parts of Europe. But it also means talking about alternative policies. Talking about, because one of the striking things about the crisis is that neoliberalism is intellectually in fragments, but it still guides the policies of all the leading states and international institutions. If resistance is to be politically credible, then it has to be related to policies that offer an alternative to neoliberalism and that point the way towards a different kind of economy. And if you look at what's happening in Greece at the minute, there are beginning to be debates about what those alternatives might be. So this is both a really terrifying moment, because what we're faced with, a prospect, is of an extension of the crisis on the backs of enormous suffering for working people and the poor, not just in Britain or Europe, but throughout the world. But it's also a moment at which, if resistance develops, then we can see a struggle for real alternatives beginning to emerge.